and welcome. Uh, Welcome to this webinar, which is part of the On Think Tanks School Free webinar series. This is the 14th webinar this year, and we've had very interesting sessions so far on issues such as public engagement, business development, think tank networks, leadership, funder relationship. These are just some to name. These are just to name a few. So be sure to check out our website to view past webinars and sign up for upcoming ones. And today we have with us Cameron Neylon, Professor of Research Communication at the Centre for Culture and Technology at Curtin University in Australia. Cameron writes and speaks regularly on scholarly communication, the design of web-based tools for research, and the need for policy and cultural change within and around the research community. His research and broader work focuses on how we can make the institutions that support research sustainable and fit for purpose for the 21st century, and how the new forms of communication might affect it for good or for bad. Cameron was also with us in the last OTT conference in Geneva in February this year, and you can also see his talk in our YouTube channel. Today's webinar will last 45 minutes, and the first 20 will be devoted to the presentation. And please keep your microphones muted throughout. And if you have any questions at any time, please write it in the chat box, and I will pass them along to Cameron. We will then have around 20 to 25 minutes for a Q&A session in which you can continue to ask questions. And without further delay, please help me welcome Cameron. Hello.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation. Just getting myself organised with all the bits and pieces. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation. Thank you for coming along. I talk about research excellence, research evaluation, and make some fairly strong claims about the way in which we think about it today. I'll start by acknowledging the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which my university and campus is based, and acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and their continuing connection with and custodianship of the land. And it's particularly important in the context of this talk to recognise that the basis on which my campus, and indeed most Western campuses in Europe and North America as well as Australia, are fundamentally based on colonial expropriation of resources, which is what enables us in many ways to do what we do. So we need to recognise that. So let me start by talking a little bit about excellence. And excellence it's hard to imagine that it's something you could argue against. It's obviously a good thing. I mean, who would want to argue against it? But the problem comes when we start to ask, what does it actually mean? My own university wants us to strive for excellence and distinction. University College of London has a commitment to excellence. Cape Peninsula University of Technology in South Africa prizes excellence, but the University of Westminster demands excellence, which is an interesting sort of ratcheting up of the requirements. And some places like Princeton just have excellence. They don't need to claim it or require to do any work for it. They just naturally have it because of who they are, presumably. But what is this excellence in? What is it for? What does it do? Well, again, University of Westminster focuses on excellence in professionally relevant teaching. Indiana University is focused on research and education, and this is a common thing in university mission statements. Teaching, research, public engagement sometimes appears, and then sometimes there is something else that appears. In this case, the University of Toledo, in its mission statement, is a Centre for Excellence for Cultural, Athletic and Other Events, which is an interesting variant on the teaching, research and engagement theme. So even if we have some sense about what this excellence is for or what it's doing, can we actually tell what it is? Can we tell where it is? Can we measure it or determine it in any particular way? And what do these university statements tell us about what they're thinking? So at UC Davis, they refer to hundreds of faculty having earned prestigious honours and prizes, and they talk about rankings. The University of Missouri has a more abstract notion of being satisfied with no less than the highest goals. Not medium, not enough, not satisfactory, but absolutely the highest goals you can envision. But in turn, that involves regional, national, and global standards, as well as personal expectations. So again, these are fairly vague. They're not really being pinned down. And this, in the end, is not wildly surprising. The sort of primary scholar of this kind of area, Michelle Lamont, in How Professors Think, actually starts in her entire book with this sentence, that excellence is the holy grail of academic life, which we have to agree with, having seen that universities and others are very concerned with claiming, pursuing, and working on excellence. That sentence is then almost immediately followed by this one, that excellence is produced and defined in a multitude of sites by an array of actors. So we don't necessarily know what it means. It may be more to do with where it happens or why it's happened or who it's happening from or to. And Jack Stilgoe, in slightly more polemic mode in an essay against excellence, which was in The Guardian some years ago, says that excellence tells us nothing about how important the science is and everything about who decides. That excellence is really about who is doing the measuring, not what is being measured. And one of the things you notice when you start looking at all the different uses of excellence in talk about research is that it's almost always a way of avoiding a difficult conversation. It's a way of avoiding talking about values, about the really difficult conversations around what it is that matters to us and why it matters. We can use this external word, this thing that no one can argue with, as a way of avoiding having to negotiate whether we actually share concerns about what is important. And the problem with that is that because it's become externalized, because these are extrinsic motivations that are being measured with numbers and rankings and citations and impact factors, that excellence ends up becoming a performance, and we end up performing what we think is excellent rather than actually having excellent performance. And what we think is excellent, and this is perhaps being shown extensively by the award of the 2 Nobel Prizes, one in medicine and one in physics over the last 2 days, is it looks like old white men from the UK or the US with beards. Now, chasing after these measures and these numbers and try to prove that we're better than everyone else isn't restricted, of course, to the people who do well. This is actually the first version of the talk I'm giving, the article that we wrote when we were first thinking about this. And of course, we were really excited about the fact that we got lots and lots of downloads and citations and views. We have one of the highest altmetric scores for any articles in this journal. We got lots of citations, well, lots of citations according to one index, but maybe not so many come from another index. But this is just to show that, you know, we're not immune, I'm not immune to chasing after the ideas, the notions of what we want to try and achieve. And we don't always think about what it is we're actually aiming to do, what it is, again, that we value and that matters to us. So excellence is contextual. It's something that can only be determined in a particular context, for a particular purpose, after a difficult negotiation around what it is that means, if we're going to take this seriously. And that means it's dangerous, because it's very easy to just look externally, to look for international journals and international rankings, international metrics to tell us what it is that is internationally excellent. And I want to argue that that takes us towards needing to think about this as a neo-colonial agenda. So what do I mean by that? And in particular, what do I mean about this neo-colonial? So taking a step back and thinking about knowledge production particularly in post-colonies around the world, there are various different reasons for funding and resourcing knowledge production. There's for building an international profile, there's for solving local problems, there's for building an absorptive capacity, and what this means is the ability to take on and use research from other parts of the world. And sometimes it's simply as an economic booster, for purely Keynesian economics, that investing in something is good for getting turnover. And this is actually not a bad argument. It's one of the better arguments in the West, including Europe and North America, for funding research as it happens. But it's also resource intensive. So if it's resource intensive, it needs to be done well, particularly if resources are scarce. And so what does it mean for it to be done well? And what does it mean for it to be done well in a post-colony? And is there the local capacity to tell if it is being done well? And this is where we start to run into the problems. Now that's, in a sense, a classical post-colonial analysis. We talk about the capacities that have been destroyed by a history of colonialism, that there's to impose a deficit model or other kinds of models of decolonial or post-colonial thinking. But that still doesn't get us to why I'm saying this is neo-colonial. And I think this is the really important point that I want to argue, is that the classical agendas and systems of research excellence are not just a repetition of colonial expropriation from post-colonial countries and spaces, but it's actually a new cycle of colonization. And the reason I say that is excellence in its implementation, in the way we think about it today, is new. This is a graph from a text corpus that happens to be addresses from the President of the Royal Society, and it's just the counts of the times the word excellence appears in that address over the course of the 20th century. And you can see there's getting more of them. We have more excellence at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century than we had in the 20th century. But what's interesting is the actual use of that word has changed. At the beginning of the 20th century, it's very explicit, very specific. It talks about a person's work, a body of work, or it talks about a very specific thing. Even in the 80s, this spike is about centers of excellence, a quite specific thing. But it's around 2000 and later that we start talking about it in the abstract, as though it's a thing itself, and therefore a thing that could be counted or measured. Because it's new, there are new models and new actors involved, and also new forms of structural bias. And I just want to show you quickly two of those. This is the system at my university that we use for collecting research outputs. A lot of this is automatic. So what will normally happen is, as long as I publish my work in the places where Western and European and North American people publish them, it gets automatically put into the system. But if I was to publish in an Indian journal or an African journal or a Latin American journal that didn't appear in Web of Science or Scopus or PubMed, then I have to go over here and I have to fill out this form to get my material into our database. There's a classic form of a new cycle of structural bias that's biased against the kinds of places that might actually reflect local interest. This is a graph that probably many of you have seen that just shows that the number of articles being published, at least in these Western journals, on issues that have to do with South African mortality are not related to the actual percentage of mortality. That diseases of rich people, and therefore diseases that are of interest in so-called international journals, get more attention than diseases and mortality risks of poor people, like lower respiratory tract infection, diarrhea, and road injury. So what do we do about this? And again, yeah, what's the white male presenting person from Europe or Australia, telling you about this? I think there are some answers if we think about this from a network perspective. Some of you may recognize this, particularly if you're from Latin America. This is the Sabato-Botana triangle. It's a little bit like the triple helix, if you're familiar with that. The idea is that there are three are poles to the role in which research and technology can play a role in development. And it is a developmental model. What's interesting about it is that Sabato and Botana make the point that what matters is not so much the strength of each corner of the triangle, but the evenness of the relationships between them. And if we think about this from, sorry, one step back, and they say that there's a particular failure mode that occurs when one of those corners is more tightly connected into the international system than it is into the local, national, or regional system. Now, from a network perspective, we would appreciate that we need to think about this a little bit more sophisticated than just points on a triangle. There isn't a clear definition between the bottom corner, which is the scientific technological system, and the government at the top, or commercial and productive systems on the bottom right. There are networks, and people might be between those or connecting those in different ways. But those are clusters we can think about. And we can measure, and in fact we know perfectly well, that the international system of research, the international system of research excellence, has a real tendency to suck the attention of local, well-resourced researchers away from local connections and into this international, and again with scare quotes, system, which is dominated by North America and Northwestern Europe. What's interesting about this is that I think we can start to think about measuring these connections and ask the question, are things moving in the right direction? Is there evidence of the policy interventions and resourcing that is strengthening local connections amongst researchers, and local connections amongst researchers and local industry and government and research? And we can start to ask in a networked world whether we are connecting things up in a local sense. When we look at citations, this is a map of airline maps in the world, which of course also reflects colonial history. And if we look at citations, we can also see that citations are being mined from post-colonies, from lower and middle income countries, to the traditional centres of Western research. And again, that the directions of those citations and the places they go to are often driven by colonial history. But nonetheless, I'd say this is a new cycle, a new process in which we're putting in new systems that allow for that new cycle of expropriation. So, and I'll finish up with a couple of final thoughts. The point I want to make is that the way we can address this, the way others can address it, because it's not my place to tell anyone how to address it, is by building the right networks and being purposeful in the way we think about building the networks that link research into society. And this requires something quite special. It requires institutionalizing locality. But what I mean by that is that we need to build research systems, industrial systems, governmental systems that support and privilege local connections. The problem with research excellence as an agenda is that it fundamentally privileges the international connections. It privileges the breakdown of that Sabato triangle and the over-connection of people into the international rather than the local, which is not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing that has to be abandoned altogether, but that the balance needs to be reset. And agreeing to adhere to what Scopus or Web of Science are telling you about what matters in research. Ironically, companies that are based in London and Amsterdam, same sites as the East India companies of the 18th century, is not going to help build those local connections. So the goals that we're trying to achieve here are to think about ways to value, to measure, and to track the formation of local connections. And local might not be geographical necessarily. It could have other kinds of thought processes around locality But to privilege those over an assumption that something that is of general interest is necessarily better, that something of, again, quote, international, and I have tried to adopt the term North Atlantic, because when we say international, we don't mean international, we mean Northwestern Europe and North America. That adopting local questions of what is valued, what is matters, what's important, and what are the qualities that are important for local research is the way forward. And in the aspirational longer term, I think there's an argument here that post-colonies, low middle income countries, whatever words we use, have a real potential to lead the world. Whenever I speak to researchers outside Northwestern Europe and North America, I'm always impressed by the quality of contextual motivation that people bring, the concerns they have about solving local problems, a concern that honestly is often lost in colleagues in the UK, the Netherlands, the US, and to some extent Canada. There's something about caring more about local challenges and issues and solutions that I think is a potential leadership opportunity, not something that's complementary or different, but something that the West, the North, should actually be paying a great deal more attention to. One example of this, and this is one example amongst many, those diseases that I showed you earlier, the number of articles, if you actually look at South Africa compared to a place like the Netherlands, and compare the amount of open access for articles in those disease areas, the same sets of articles we were looking at before, South Africa has been outperforming the Netherlands for a very long time in all of those areas. Now, South Africa has its own issues and is a special place in its own right. But nonetheless, I think there's examples that are starting to emerge over and over again that post-colonies, that developing countries, spaces in beyond the traditional centres of Western research are frequently doing better on agendas of public engagement, of diversity and inclusion, and of access and communication. So this is all about building the right networks and valuing the right networks. It's about thinking about how we build strong institutions and communities that are concerned about local value. And it's also about maintaining those, because this isn't all a good story. This is a graph that I've taken from the work of Professor Jianwen Wang in China, who looked at open access, in particularly open access publishing, by a range of countries. And what the graph shows is that Brazil had an enormous lead over the rest of the world up until about 2012, but it's been losing that lead. And in part, it's been losing that lead precisely because the country adopted metrics and systems that came from the North Atlantic. And as a result, people have moved away from publishing in local open access journals from Latin America and to publishing more in subscription journals that actually people in Latin America may not even be able to read, and are more commonly, in any case, in English. So this is all fundamentally about privileging the local and really thinking about how we build systems that maintain a sense of what the value of the local is, and that our values can be local, and that that's a really important part of thinking about how we produce knowledge. That can provide the strength and confidence to effectively utilize the global systems and the global knowledge that is also being produced worldwide. And when I use global, I mean global, not international in its narrow sense. So I just want to finish with a quote from a colleague at Curtin University. Kim Scott is a prize-winning author. He's also a Noongar man, an Indigenous Australian. And one of the projects that he's worked on has actually been to repatriate records of Indigenous language in Western Australia. And that project to me is particularly interesting because what they're doing is taking the recordings and the transcriptions, and they're taking those out of the archives and taking them back to the descendants of the people who were, not always willingly, interviewed and recorded to record that language, which at the time the people doing the recording assumed was dying. And what they do is they take those records, those stories, those songs, those words, and they take them into community. This is not a conversation that happens outside the group, not a conversation that comes outside the trusted group that's trying to rebuild this fragmented and fractured culture after a history of Western colonization. And as they become more confident with the stories that they're recreating, with the songs that they're reimagining, and with the language that they're rebuilding, from time to time, they're comfortable with sharing that with the wider world as they build that heritage. And I think there's something really important here in the confidence to say, this is our culture, these are our values and our needs. And when we're ready, we will share those. And when we're ready, we'll consider what you think is of value. So to finish, what I just want to really emphasize is all of these measures of excellence that I've sort of skipped over and haven't talked about, impact factors, citations, Web of Science, Scopus, all of these things are new. They're all recent. They don't tell us very much at all, to be honest, anyway. But they're particularly unhelpful for communities in post-colonies looking to build their own confident and relevant and contextual set of knowledge production systems. And so the way to address that, I think, is to really think about how we can evaluate and value the qualities of research that matter in the different sites where it can happen, the knowledge production of communities and how that can be combined and what works locally. And I will finish there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Cameron. That was very, very interesting. And while people get to write their questions, so if you've not seen it, there's a chat function at the bottom, so you can type any questions there that you have for Cameron. And so to start, I've written some of the questions of my own, and I have a lot of issues I would like to discuss, but I'll try to make it short. You've mentioned that good research is contextual. So can you elaborate a bit more on what in context influences that research is good or not? I have two more, and then you can choose which ones to address. Then, even if it's contextual, are there any measures of good research? So are there any standards? I know there's some indexes or rankings that are trying to incorporate. So the RQ Plus has some indicators that if the research, that the researcher must have thought of the implications, that it's been, I forgot the word in English, spoken with, so there's the spoken with stakeholders, and they've considered gender issues. So is that the sort of thing that is that sort of index or line would be a better kind of measure, I don't of research? And then wait, I think the other one is a complete set of different questions, so I'll
Okay, so I mean, so the short answer is there a universal way of determining whether something is good research? No. It's the simple answer. In the same way, there's no universal way of telling whether someone's a good person, or it's too complicated a question. Now, we can look at the way a lot of research is done and ask how well it is doing at various things. For instance, solving or dealing with local issues, engaging the communities that are affected by the topic under consideration. And in the majority of cases, I would say, or at least on balance, you know, I think we can say that we do pretty badly at that. And we do worse on it, I think. That's an assertion, but I think we do worse on it as we move, again, towards the North Atlantic. So these questions of diversity and inclusion, not just in the research teams or in the people deciding within the system what is being done or how it's being done, but also a diversity of perspectives in framing questions, in defining what matters. I think it's clear that we can do better on that across the board. And it's, yeah, and we can clearly do better on better communication, better transparency, and communication in the sense that provides useful information to people on the ground. There are some aspects of Western knowledge production that I think, or that I believe, do have some general value. And it's quite hard to articulate what they are, but at the core of it is something that's actually quite core to the sort of the mess that is the scientific method, which is we don't assume we have the answer. We assume we have to test the answer. And I think also in the humanities traditions in Western scholarship, actually we have a good thing of assuming, not assuming we have the question right. And again, area studies, work in you know, feminism and particularly intersectional studies has really attacked a lot of those questions, a lot of the ways in which we've asked questions. And I think there are tools there that can be generally helpful, but they're not the complete set of tools and they're not the complete set of answers. So the question of what's contextual, or what is, you know, what does that mean in context, is contextual. I think there are a couple of different stories that appeal to me, and I always get these stories wrong, so they're narratives rather than necessarily good reportage. But there's one which is a story about how a whole area of disease studies, this is in North America, this is in the US, were looking at a particular disease, and they thought of it, the researchers thought of this as a disease of the blood, thought of it as an issue with some sort of imbalance in proteins in the blood. And they'd worked on this for about 20 years trying to find treatments and systems. And then they thought, oh, maybe we should ask the patients what they think this disease is. And the patients thought it was a disease of the bowel. They experienced it as digestive problems, which opened up a whole series of treatments that massively enhanced the quality of life of patients. And then another example is a story of a waterborne disease that appeared in a South American country and was appealing to be quite dangerous. And so some Western scientists swooped in, they took the water samples back to North America, they sequenced the bacterium, they identified that there was a particular drug they could use that would kill that bacterium, was a good antibiotic, and then they realized it was far too expensive. And in the meantime, the people on the ground had realized that they could actually use some local plant fibers to filter the water, and that was fine, and that solved the problem. So we have to frame questions and issues in ways that are relevant to local people, to local issues, to local problems. And that's, you know, an ongoing challenge to do that well. But the only means of really making progress on it is to actually engage people and give them the power to actually make some of those decisions. Give them not just a seat at the table, but a voice at the table. To be part of a community process that's seeking to make knowledge and solve problems and address the issues that we're facing globally.
Okay. While you were speaking at the end, I was thinking of the word local, and what does that mean? I live in a country with three broad regions. One is the coast, one is the highlands, and one is the Amazon. And the people that live in the Amazon are completely different, and the plans that they have available to care for these things are different than the ones in the highlands. And so I think I'm not giving an answer or anything. I think it further complicates what we need to do. So what can we do with this divergent knowledge, different local communities, and the scarce resources of governments? This is just a discussion.
Yeah. No, and it's hard, right? So it's messy. There are no simple answers to this. And although I guess I didn't go into this, part of the problem with any singular definition of what is good research and what is excellent research will privilege one of those three voices, and particularly people from one particular background or experience within those regions. What's necessary over time, and this is a political economy question in the end. We need to build up the kinds of communities that are confident in themselves of the knowledge they hold to negotiate with other groups. And we're quite good at doing this in the professional research world. We have disciplines and we have departments, and we have a whole series of mechanisms that allow and encourage groups to form and then bring them into contact so that we have to negotiate claims. So peer review is one example of an institution that forces us to do this, but so are conferences and disciplines and universities and departments. And we have this system in which we gradually negotiate in bigger and bigger groups, and the knowledge that is shared in those bigger and bigger groups is more and more abstract. And while we've got much better with an agenda of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research and talking to each other inside the academy, the result of that has been we've built bigger and bigger walls around the academy. And so the question for me is, how do we take the experience of this, and it's messy and it doesn't always work, but these systems that build community, that make them a bit porous, that bring them into contact, that force us on a day-to-day basis to negotiate and argue, how could that work in bigger spaces? Because the risk is, and this is the world that we're finding ourselves in, is that we end up divided in two. So if we have, the people who are for Trump versus the people who are against Trump, the people who are for Brexit versus the people who are against Brexit, and the people who are for Bolsonaro and the people who are against Bolsonaro. When we get to that point, there's very little we can do to negotiate because we're split into two. But if we can maintain more messiness and more negotiation at smaller scales, then we stand some chance of continually negotiating. I don't know what that looks like in civil society, beyond the fact that it means we need to have more civil society. And indeed, arguably, more of the kind of work that many of the On Think Tanks members do in terms of building community around particular issues.
I think that's really interesting, and I think it follows well with the next kind of set of questions, comments that I had. So it is this building these internal communities that made me think a lot of the map that you presented with how citations go from the world, and it's just from the south to what looks that it's in the south except Australia and up there, but nothing connecting. So less Latinos connect a bit, but not that much. But we're not connecting with Africa. We're not connecting with Southeast Asia. So I think that community building idea can work well as well with cross pollination of ideas, which
and there's good. We think we're still trying to do the analysis on this because it's quite hard to do well. But we think there's some good news on that, that the picture that you often see, in fact, the picture that I showed, that is very much Latin American citations flowing to Spain and Portugal, and North America, African citations flowing to France and the UK mainly. And very little, as you say, across the Atlantic, Southern Atlantic Ocean. That seems to be starting to break down. So we're seeing some evidence of more interconnection, both more within Africa, which is where we look, within Africa connections, but also more evidence of Africa to Southern America connections, less so with Southeast Asia, but it's really hard analysis to do well because it's not always easy to pin down exactly where the research is going on, and so that creates some complications. But.
And we have two questions. One from Annapurna saying if there's a common definition for excellence. And then if you can say something on the role of funding.
Mm-hmm.
So Joanna works for an international research organization with a mission to bring underrepresented knowledge and voices.
Yep.
International academic and policy audiences, but they also need to have competitive funding. So how can we square the circle, she says?
Yes.
So
and I think those two questions fit together. So in terms of Annapurna's question, I'm arguing that there shouldn't be a common definition for excellence, and where there is one, it's going to bias against underrepresented and otherwise underprivileged groups. The reality, as Joanna's saying, is that particularly when you're looking for funding to do work, you're having to compete with other people, and a lot of those other people will be claiming forms of research excellence, experience, it might be termed as, or infrastructure or environment, or they might use other words, but what they're really saying is that we're more traditional players who have a record. How do you square that circle? It's hard. One of the things I say in sort of extended, the paper version of this talk, which is at the link at the bottom of the screen, I think that I'm still sharing, is that this is not about abandoning or refusing necessarily to play that game at some level, because playing the game is necessary in some contexts, but it's also so I think it's in part the reason I give these talks, and I give these talks to funders, including some of the ones that that fund some of this work, is to try and persuade them to think differently. And I think there are examples of funders that are thinking differently in terms of prioritization and allocation of resources. So I think there's two things you can do. One is to report back successes that don't necessarily fit, to really say that these are things you value and that perhaps your funders should also value them. That really does get a good reception in my experience, particularly if they're unusual. Funders love to have a good story to tell. And as they tell those stories, that becomes part of the normative framework of what it is that they're looking for and what it is that they're thinking about. So you can influence some of those stories. But at the same time, there's some work that, I'm sure you've all got different ways of doing it, but seeking to make sure that you get at least in the door, at least to the table, whether that's through collaborations, whether that's through acceding to standard definitions and getting things into some of the normal journals, or in some of the normal ways. So it's a hard problem, and this is about normative and cultural change, and those are not easy problems to solve. But I think there are positive signs that people are seeking to change things, and I think there's receptivity to people saying how they should change, which is positive. It's a step. It's just a step, but it's a step. But it is at least a step.
Okay, but thank you very much for this. We have now run out of time. I've enjoyed our conversation and the questions as well a lot. And if you have any further questions, we can just take it on to Twitter. I think you're very active on it, so we can continue talking on this. And thanks again. And to everyone, I look forward to seeing you in another session. And Cameron, hopefully see you soon as well. Bye.
Hopefully. Thanks.